Hello and welcome. Thank you very much for joining me for another presentation as part of the GreyLearning webinar series sponsored by Tamron. And today we're going to be talking about common mistakes in photography. And what is sort of amusing to me about this, I was thinking about the notion of photographers sharing their images, of course, which is part of why we capture photos in the first place, is to be able to share those photos with others. And naturally, there's a tendency to share your best photos, to say, hey, look at this great photo that I captured, never really mentioning necessarily that there might be lots and lots of other photos you captured, maybe a series of images that were not so good, building up to the final, the good version of the photo. And so today, in rare fashion, I'm gonna talk about mistakes. I'm actually going to fess up to some of the mistakes that I even still continue to make sometimes, either just accidentally not paying attention or, forgetting about an important tip in photography. And certainly I encourage all of you along the way, if you've got questions, or especially if you've got other tips that you think are worthy of sharing, put those into the questions and I can share as many of those as possible and address as many questions as we have time for. But let's go ahead and dive in. First off, I do want to thank Tamron for making this webinar series possible, for sponsoring the GreyLearning webinar series. If you haven't already, there's actually a series of really cool videos if you go to the Tamron YouTube page. That's youtube.com/TamronVids, as in videos. And there's a number of great videos there, but in particular, I'm a fan of the One Location, One Lesson, and One Lens series. So I would suggest checking that out. Not just the video that features me, there was an episode filmed of me out in the Palouse, the beautiful rolling hills in eastern Washington state, but a variety of other photographers are featured as well. I think they're all quite interesting and very well put together. So be sure to check those out. For those of you who don't know me, I am Tim Grey, and I love photography, of course, and I love sharing my hopeful knowledge about photography. And, it's sort of funny. Here's a photo of me playing around a little bit, snorkeling near the Great Barrier Reef off the coast of Australia. This was just a few weeks ago, and oh my goodness, how things have changed since. In fact, I didn't expect that we would have webinars for a bit longer because I was due to be traveling. I traveled from Miami, Florida, and made my way eventually down to Australia. And this, actually, I was teaching on board a cruise ship and was intending to go then to Southeast Asia and through the Suez Canal into the Mediterranean, and all of that was cut short in dramatic fashion as all of us now worldwide are dealing with this pandemic that will hopefully pass very quickly. In the meantime, it gives us an opportunity maybe to focus on cleaning house a little bit, many of us, with our Lightroom catalogs, and also to just kind of refocus on the things we love, those around us, of course, as well as photography. And so we're going to be having a variety of additional webinar presentations I hope you'll join me for. Many of you are already signed up for the online workshops that we're kicking off here, focused on Lightroom Classic. But we'll try to make the best of a challenging situation. And as long as we're going to be on virtual lockdown here, we might as well get online and talk about photography. And speaking of photography and that trip that was cut short a little bit, along the way I was sharing photos on Instagram. I actually have a few additional photos that I'll probably share in the near future. And so I would certainly enjoy having you follow me on Instagram. If you're using a mobile device with the Instagram app, you can just search for me as Tim Grey Photo, or you can point your web browser to instagram.com/Tim Grey Photo to check out and hopefully follow me and like my photos. But if nothing else, just to check them out and see what you think. But let's get started with these common mistakes in photography, mistakes that I think are worth reminding ourselves about and trying to make sure that to the best of our ability, we avoid those mistakes. And first and foremost, I think a key mistake is to make sure not to get caught without a camera. I've talked many times about different scenarios. To be fair, sometimes I actually intentionally don't bring a camera, or don't bring, as I refer to it, a real camera, my digital SLR, for example, because I just want to focus on the experience. In other cases, I might have not brought a camera for other reasons, such as here. on the island of Capri and a beautiful sunset, but it also happened to be my wedding anniversary, so I wasn't about to bring my SLR with me and focus on photography, but naturally I did have my smartphone with me. And so at the very least, we can hopefully be sure to always have a smartphone, which, as many of you have already discovered, are capable of capturing really incredible photos. And so at least having a smartphone or a little compact camera, I'll have samples taken with another camera as well, so that if you don't have your SLR, you still have a way to essentially capture a good memory, even if you don't have all the control, all the bells and whistles that your bigger camera makes possible. So trying to be sure that, to the extent possible, we've always got some sort of camera with us so we don't miss out on great photographic opportunities. Another mistake, and this is in one of those categories where I feel it used to be something we talked about a lot, and then we suddenly sort of stopped talking about it, or not talking about it as much, maybe not thinking about it as much, and that is sensor dust. And even I fall victim to this sometimes. I was on this trip, I was using a single all-in-one zoom lens, a Tamron 18 to 400 millimeter lens on this trip, so that I would have the convenience of just a single lens and the benefit of a lighter camera bag without so many lenses in it. And I think it gave me a little bit of complacency because in my mind I was thinking I'm not changing lenses at all, so I don't need to worry about sensor dust. But there probably had already been some sensor dust on the camera. It had probably been too long since I had cleaned the sensor. And so I was capturing some photos here on a boat and capturing images with a little bit of a long exposure to get this motion blur effect in the water as the boat is speeding across the surface of the water. And of course, to get a relatively slow shutter speed on a bright sunny day, I had to stop the lens aperture down, in this case down to f/22, and that brought all of that sensor dust into clear focus. And so all of these little spots all around the image that you can see that I didn't realize were going to be an issue. I got back and reviewed these photos and was quite disappointed and dismayed. Now in this case, fortunately, these spots would be pretty easy to clean up, but I don't want to have to clean these spots up over and over and over again for all of my different photos. I'd rather clean them up once, meaning clean the sensor and get those spots out of the way. And so my recommendation is, at the very least, to check for dust on a regular basis before you're heading out on a photo trip, for example, or a photo shoot, and then making sure to check periodically and clean as needed. And just as a reminder, you can check for dust very easily. Just set the lens aperture all the way to the smallest size, the largest aperture number. So for example, in many cases that might be f/22. And then take a normal exposure of a plain area. So, a sheet of paper, an empty wall, something that doesn't have any real detail in it, any objects in it. So just an empty area of a wall. And then during the exposure, move the camera around so that, indoors, for example, you'd probably be able to get a half second or a full second exposure time. Move the camera around so that any spots on the wall, for example, will be blurred out, and then the dust spots will be rendered nice and sharp, so you can check those out. Zoom in, take a look at the photo, make sure there's not any spots, and of course, if there are, do a cleaning or send your camera in for cleaning as the case may be. Another mistake that we might periodically run into, even if we think we're doing a good job of paying attention to our camera settings, sometimes you get a little bit excited about a subject. So here, for example, this was in Cartagena, Colombia, and there was obviously a peacock there, and it was on full display, and I got all excited about trying to get a photo, squatting down, and of course the bird keeps moving, and so I've got to keep moving. And I was so focused on just trying to get a shot framed up that I wasn't paying careful attention to the shutter speeds I was getting. I had been focused on subjects that were in bright sunlight just before this. This peacock was in the shade, and so it was a little bit darker, a bit slower shutter speed. And so zooming in here, for example, you can see that we've got a bit of motion blur. You can see it especially in the beak and a little bit in the eye area. It's most pronounced. but a bit of blur caused by motion because I'm, squatting down on the ground and trying to get a clear shot and moving the camera around just a little bit as I'm wobbling there trying to stay steady. And fortunately, partway through realized that I was getting slow shutter speed. Sometimes it's a bit obvious, right? You go to take a picture and you hear the shutter and it does that clunk, clunk instead of the click, click, the fast rate. You can tell just by the sound. In this case, it wasn't especially slow, but it was too slow for the circumstances. Fortunately, I caught it in time and was able to get some nice photos of the peacocks that were nice enough to put on a little bit of a show. Of course, in other situations, you might have the opposite, where the shutter speed is too fast. This, for example, just about sunrise and the wake of the ship. In this case, this is right off the coast of Kangaroo Island in Australia. And I thought the light was very nice, the texture was very nice. And this was one of those experiences where it looked so beautiful, and yet it wasn't really translating into photos. I would take a couple shots, look at the LCD, and it just wasn't working out very good. It didn't look as beautiful as the experience was. And then I realized if I slowed down the shutter a little bit, instead of trying to freeze the action here, if I slowed things down to get a little bit of a blurring effect, then it might make for a more interesting photo. And so in this case, I think it worked better. Maybe not an image I'm necessarily going to hang on the wall, but I think better than the image where all that motion was rendered as not moving, as crisp detail. I think a little motion blur in this case actually worked. Of course, the cliche example would be something like a waterfall, but the point is to try to think about what shutter speed might be appropriate and not always focus on freezing the action. Keep in mind that sometimes we might actually want to allow for a little bit of a motion blur, sometimes a lot of blur, maybe a long exposure, for example. But point being is that sometimes we want a fast shutter speed, sometimes we want a slow, and sometimes it's not necessarily obvious what the ideal shutter speed is going to be. So if the situation allows for it, to try to kind of experiment a little bit and play around with different options in terms of that shutter speed. And related to that, I guess, in terms of, crisp detail with a fast shutter speed versus a little motion blur with a slower shutter speed would be focus. And I have from time to time neglected to notice where my focus point was and ended up with an image that was not sharp. This is a particularly disappointing situation in this particular photo. When I captured the photo, I looked at the screen, I really liked the image, I thought it was going to be great. When I got back to my computer later, I discovered it was not sharp. There was what appeared to be a little bit of motion blur, but on closer examination, I realized that the camera had, notice I'm trying to blame the camera here, the camera had focused on the water, essentially in the foreground, rather than in the background. In this particular case, it was a challenge in part because I was on a small boat. You can see the water is slightly rough anyway, but enough of a swell that there was some movement. And so I'm trying to steady myself and frame up the shot and take a picture and focus. And so I'm using autofocus, and the focusing point actually was at the center of the frame. But because I was getting bounced around so much, the camera focused on the water in the foreground at a moment when the camera was dipped down. As I reframe, it wasn't able to acquire focus fast enough in order to focus on the trees in the background, which is what I actually wanted. In this case, it was mostly that turbulence on the water, but sometimes you might even, for example, set the focus point to the foreground thinking you're going to get more depth of field than you really are. So ignoring, for example, the fact that maybe you've got the lens wide open so that you can get a fast shutter speed and you're not actually going to get enough depth of field to have the background be sharp. So in this case, I guess it was a combination of both. I was shooting relatively wide open, but the intent was to have the trees in focus and let the water in the foreground fall off. And unfortunately, that didn't happen. So making a point of trying to keep track of where you're setting your focus point. For me personally, I tend to have a single focus point that I'll move around within the viewfinder so I can position the autofocus where I want it in the frame. Of course, many of you might also use an array of focus points where the camera is choosing specifically which portion of the frame to focus on, and it will give you a little visual indication of which focus point is activated. And so paying attention to that and making sure that you're focusing in the right area on your key subject, in the right portion of your key subject, for example. Moving on to some issues of composition, neglecting to simplify. Now, this is one of those that goes in both directions, as I'll talk about, but for example, here on this beautiful tropical island and a sort of classic, if not cliche, anchoring with an object in the foreground, some boats off in the distance, the beautiful water and the beach. And that's all well and good. I love this photo. I think it's a really beautiful scene. It was a wonderful beach to be able to walk on and go swimming at. But I do find that very often the more impactful photos are those that are a little bit simpler. And that doesn't mean that I'm only going to capture the simplified version of the scene. I'm still going to take photos such as this one, but then I always try to sort of survey the scene and try to evaluate, are there smaller elements within the scene that I particularly like that I might want to extract from that scene to create a separate photo, a variation on a theme essentially. And so in this particular case, for example, this photo of just the beach, of just the water, with a little bit of a diagonal line here, leading line of sorts. And so finding other variations on a scene, and in particular looking for ways that we can simplify. And I do find that many photographers have a tendency to include too much in the frame, to shoot rather wide. And the intent, of course, is to share as much as possible, right? This is a beautiful scene. Everything here looks great. I want to show you all of it. But sometimes you can get greater impact by simplifying, by having just a small portion of the scene, just enough to convey the beauty of a place, for example, without the distraction of lots of other things going on. Now, of course, that leads, if you correct for that problem, if you tend to shoot a lot of wide shots without focusing in, zeroing in on the details, it can lead to the opposite problem, which I really personally have a tendency to do myself. I, more often than not, shoot lots of tight shots, zeroing in on details, and then I forget about the wider view. So I, come away and look at these details of these remarkable Moai statues, but then there's the risk that I might forget to show you what it was like to actually be on Easter Island, for example. And so making sure that you're including some wider views. I often think of these as establishing shots, as showing people what the place looked like, what the experience was like in that location. It might not be the photo that you hang on the wall, those wider views, but they'll often be useful in things, like slideshows or articles where you're sharing your images with others and showing them a sense of what it was like in that place, in addition to the more detailed photos. And so here, for example, a wider view of some of the Moai statues on Easter Island. In this case, this is a 3-shot panorama with a wide-angle lens, so assembling those into this sort of distorted view caused by that perspective, or even just shooting ultra-wide and including lots of sky. So just different perspectives on similar subjects. And really, it's not so much about always seeking out a wider view or always seeking out a detailed view, a more simplified view, but trying to make sure that you're thinking about all of the different possibilities, that you're getting a variety of shots from a variety of different angles with a variety of different perspectives, some of which will be your favorites that you might hang on the wall, and some of them might be just supplemental images that you use as part of your storytelling when you're sharing your photos later, depending, of course, on how it is that you share those photos. And sort of a variation on a theme is this notion of ignoring details and, taking a picture, photographing a subject. So here for obviously the Sydney Opera House in Sydney, Australia, and it is a subject. And of course, you're going to photograph the whole thing. And then you might neglect some of the details. And so very often what I'll do with a situation where I want to photograph the entirety of a subject, so something iconic, such as the Sydney Opera House, naturally I want to photograph the entire building. But then, once I feel that I got that shot, then I'll start to focus on some of the other details. And so the sails here that form the shapes of the opera house itself, obviously those in and of themselves are iconic. And so trying to find ways that I can isolate just a portion of the image, the overall subject. So here I was fortunate, we still had some good light, but there was a storm moving in, and so there were dark clouds off in the distance that were working their way closer. And so I was able to frame up a relatively simple shot. Now here, I think anyone would know this is the Sydney Opera House, or at least there's a really good chance they would know it's the Sydney Opera House, even though I've only included a relatively small portion of the overall subject, the overall scene. And so kind of trying to remember that there are often details within the scene that we can zero in on, even in this case, getting closer and finding a smaller detail. It almost becomes a bit of an abstract image in the sense that now you're less likely to recognize that this is the Sydney Opera House, or it might take a little bit longer to realize, oh, hey, this is the Sydney Opera House. I can sort of tell by those shapes. At first, it might seem like something entirely abstract. And so paying attention to all of the various opportunities photographically with a scene. And the way I often think about this or talk about this is that if something catches your eye, certainly you probably want to hurry up and get the shot just in case something changes. But if you have the time, if you have the opportunity to try to slow down a little bit and think about, what is it that caught my attention here? What caught my eye? What resonated with me? What are the particular things about this that I actually like? And how can I focus on that a little bit more? So in this particular example, there's a variety of things. The texture itself, the shapes, I think are quite interesting. The detail, we have the larger shapes of the sails and then the lines that form these sort of stripes. And if you look closer, it's tiles that form a little grid, a texture pattern. We also have, these arcing lines, and the sails themselves. The building has a little bit of a yellowish tint to it, and the background, the sky, has a bit of a blue tint to it. And so there's those complementary colors that work very well together. And so kind of trying to analyze some of those details. What is it that really works about this? And how can I emphasize those attributes, those things that are so interesting to me or that I think are working for that scene or that subject? Of course, if we're zeroing in on those details, there can be a little bit of a risk of framing too tightly. So a flamingo, of course, this also was in Cartagena, Colombia, in the same location that had the peacocks. They had some flamingos, and it was starting to be a little bit late in the day, probably mid-afternoon, a little bit late afternoon. And so the sun angle was starting to get nice, and we were starting to get a little bit of a golden tint to it. Not dramatic, but a little bit of a tint. But also because of all of the trees and whatnot, there was a lot of shadow. And so it really created this dramatic contrast between the highlights and the shadows in the scene in general, and especially, of course, on the flamingos. And they're such interesting birds in any event, and so I wanted to photograph them, of course. And it's a challenge because they're not holding still very long, or they, close their eyes and I want their eye open, and they, rotate just a little bit, and now I don't have a good angle on them. And so it can be a little bit of a challenge to try to get the right angle. They'd move around, and then the shadow of another bird goes over the face of, the one I was trying to photograph, and all these little tricks and challenges that were causing me difficulty. And then I finally got a shot. So the birds are in constant motion, and so I'm kind of in constant motion, and I'm nervous the light's going to change, and the shadows are moving around as the birds move around. And I finally got a shot that I was really happy with, until I took a closer look and realized just how tight I had framed things up at the top, as I'm, constantly bobbing and weaving and moving around. And of course, the flamingos in large part are moving around. I get this nice pose with this wonderful light with its eye open, but there's a lack of headroom up at the top center of the photo. Now, to be sure, I could use some tricks in Photoshop and extend the feathers of the bird up at the top right corner and easily extend the dark area up at the top of the photo. But it was so frustrating to see. I had finally gotten this one image out of at least dozens that I had taken, probably more than I want to admit that I had captured. And I had this one that worked in all respects in terms of the composition and the lighting and the drama, the color, etc. And it's a bit tight at the top. So trying to make sure that we're giving enough room. How much is enough? That's a difficult question to answer because it just needs to not feel awkward, essentially. We want our subject to not feel squeezed. And a variation on this would be making sure that we're not cutting anything off, which is another mistake that we might make. Certainly I've made this in a number of situations where I'm trying to capture a photo and I cut off a key portion of the subject. So here, a sea turtle. I was snorkeling at the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, and someone shouts from across the water that there's a sea turtle, and so I hustle over. And in this case, I just had a little compact point and shoot underwater camera, waterproof camera. So not the best camera, not the best quality, but I still want to try to get the best image that I can. And so photographing this sea turtle as it's swimming along, and I would say the fin up at the top center of the image, that's a little too close to the edge of the frame. I wish I had a little bit more room there. But down at the bottom of the frame, the fin is cut off somewhat significantly. And so I really would have preferred to have a little bit of a wider view. Or I could also crop in tighter, get a closer view so that it looks like I intentionally cut off. But the idea is that we want it to look intentional. We don't want it to look like, oops, I missed a little piece of the image here. And so trying to make sure that we're including all of the subject, for example, or framing it up in a way that makes sense and not framing too tightly. Naturally, when you're, swimming, snorkeling, and trying to photograph a sea turtle as it's swimming past you, it's exciting and things are happening quickly and it's underwater in this case with a snorkel mask on. You can't exactly see the LCD on the back of the camera all that well to try to frame up a photo. In many respects, you're almost shooting blind. And so in this case, it was going to be a challenge to get a perfectly framed shot regardless, but it certainly serves as a good reminder to try to be careful. When it's a fast-moving subject under difficult circumstances, while you're holding your breath, it obviously is going to be more difficult. But when you have a situation, a landscape, for example, where you can take a little bit more time to think about that framing, I certainly encourage you to make sure that you're framing appropriately, including enough, but not too much. And then if you're zeroing in on a subject, making sure that you're not cutting things off in an awkward way. And sometimes it's not even necessarily so much about awkwardness in that framing. It's just maybe lacking a certain amount of context. And so here on an island in Greece, I saw there was a row of these horse and buggies that were offering rides, and here the operator taking a little nap, a siesta in the back seat, and as all of them are lined up here waiting for rides. And I thought it was a cute scene. And so, once again, one of the things that I tend to do in my photography is to more or less simplify the scene as I'm photographing it. So try to make it as simple as possible. But in this case, I went a little bit too far because there actually was some context that I think was more interesting. Thankfully, I do have a tendency to capture a variety of different framings, a variety of different compositions whenever I'm photographing a particular subject. And so then on review later, I can decide which one I like better. And in this particular case, a slightly wider view that includes this light post, I think works a little bit better. It gives us a little more context, or at least visual interest. It's a bit of a framing element. And so I thought that the version with the lamppost worked better. That's not to say that everyone would agree necessarily. Perhaps you prefer the version without the lamppost. Part of the key is to have those variations so that you can make a decision later on in your workflow after you've captured your photos. But in many cases, I do find that having at least a little bit of context, and that can be a tricky balance. Here I'm saying, don't shoot too wide or don't shoot too tight. Now we've got to try to find the sweet spot. And one of the things I think it can be helpful to think about in that context is, are there more elements that I might include that gives us a little bit of a better sense of the area, or just visual interest, just something that looks nice, that's a nice addition to the frame beyond just our key subject. So tending to simplify, I certainly in my photography tend to simplify a lot, and then I have to remind myself sometimes, okay, let's look for the less simple version of the image and make sure to capture that interpretation as well. And in some cases, I find that I focus too much on the obvious subjects. So I was in Hobart on the island of Tasmania in Australia, and there happened to be, while I was there, thankfully, a boat festival, a wooden boat festival, and it was incredible. Many great boats. And of course, I'm trying to find some interesting photos. I don't want just a sea of boats. No pun intended, of course. I don't just want to show you a bunch of boats in a marina. So I was trying to find something more interesting. And so, for example, focusing on all of the masts and the flags, the sails, in this case, rolled up. And I could tell immediately, almost I didn't even bother taking the picture because I just could tell that it wasn't going to be that interesting. It wasn't working very well. Of course, trying to simplify the scene, and so finding one good mast with lots of flags and trying to photograph that. And yes, of course, I photographed some of the boats, but none of that turned out to be very interesting. It was just sort of documentary feeling, essentially. And then realizing that there were other ways to photograph the scene, the subject, in more interesting ways, in less obvious ways, or at least at the time it was less obvious to me. But my eye caught the ripples on the water reflecting the mast of a tall ship and all of the lines that were strung. And so capturing images of those reflections on the water, a not so obvious subject. You see this marina full of beautiful boats, and of course you want to photograph the boats, but then looking for maybe the not as obvious subjects that are available there as well, such as reflections on the water. And I suppose to some extent, also not necessarily entirely obvious, is, if we forget about unique angles. And so here, for example, I was in a botanic garden in Adelaide, Australia, and the plants, of course, many of the details are really beautiful. And so it's, I think, somewhat obvious. I see, this fern, for example. Let's zero in on a leaf that looks to be in good condition, and let's put the stem, the stalk, at an angle, a diagonal across the frame, and have these, additional angled lines and whatnot, and the texture and the color. It's all very wonderful and beautiful. It's also pretty obvious. It's not the most creative photo. I'm just zooming in on the subject itself. And so trying to look for, what are other interesting ways that I could photograph this subject and get something that's a little bit more captivating, a little more eye-catching. And so moving on to a different plant at the same botanic garden, and especially because it was getting illuminated by some sunlight coming from directly overhead, I was able to make note of how the leaf was getting illuminated, and I had the thought, thankfully, to get down below and photograph the leaf and its texture from below. And because the area surrounding this plant was in shadow, and the plant itself, this leaf, is getting struck by direct sunlight above, in order to get a good exposure for the leaf, I'm essentially capturing an image that's so dark, the shadows are rendered as almost pure black. There's very little detail in the background, which only serves to sort of exacerbate, to emphasize this bright light that's illuminating the leaf, showing off all these textures, the veins, etc. And so I think that finding a unique angle in the circumstance was, not the most difficult thing to come up with, of course, because we've got all this light, and, I'd already photographed the surfaces of leaves. If I get down below, the leaf almost becomes kind of like a lampshade, and now I've got this illuminated subject that I can photograph and create a bit more interesting way of looking at that subject. So finding different angles. It doesn't always just mean, get down below it or get up above it, but trying to examine all these different angles. And many times I'll find myself sort of going through this exercise of walking in a circle around a subject and trying to get up high and get down low, and trying to see both the perspective on the subject itself as well as the interaction, if you will, between the subject and the background. So if I, rotate around the subject, I could get a more simple, clean background on one side versus maybe a more cluttered background on the other side. And so trying to make sure that I'm finding the best possible angle, first and foremost, by moving my eyes around the scene, around the subject, and trying to visualize what might be a good perspective, a good angle, and as needed, sort of experimenting with those angles using your camera. And then, I find very often I'm almost surprised when I notice a subject that was right there in plain sight. Subjects that I might have otherwise thought nothing of or just simply ignored. And so, for example, here, this happens to be in Dover in the UK. And so we've got the English Channel out the window, and the window itself and the curtain, the drape. And it suddenly caught my eye like, wow, this is a really interesting still life. And fortunately, I photographed it because I actually like how the photo turned out. But it's this sort of pedestrian, everyday subject that I might otherwise just completely ignore, but it caught my eye. And whenever that happens to me, it's sort of this moment where I'm kicking myself, like, why don't I do that more often? Because there are so many interesting scenes and textures, colors, subjects, etc., that we often just sort of, walk past and don't even think about. And so trying to kind of keep in mind, we sort of, I think as photographers, I mean, I certainly know this happens with me, and I imagine for many of you as well, you're sort of in one of two modes. You're either in photography mode, where you're really being observant of your surroundings and, constantly on the lookout for subjects, or you're not in photography mode. You're just going about your daily routine. And so you're not as aware of what's around you, and so you might miss out on opportunities. And if you pay a little bit more attention in those non-photography moments, they might turn into great photography moments as well. Another example here, we were in South Africa and went in Cape Town in this case, and went out to go do some wine tasting, have a wine tasting tour. And so we get to this winery, beautiful property in the Stellenbosch area, and they had a fire going and just a beautiful scene. And I noticed their logo and the way the light of the fire was catching on the glasses. And so I set up a little still life. So as the vintner, as the winery staff are talking about their amazing wines and the terroir and all these interesting things, I'm busy framing up photos and taking pictures. So in a situation where I'm not really there to take pictures, I was there to sample some of the local wines, but it turned into a photo opportunity because I had noticed this wonderful light playing on these glasses. I think another thing, and I see this a lot with a lot of photographers, is sort of giving up when the weather's not very good. And obviously, if it's cold and rainy and windy, it's miserable and it's a little bit unpleasant. And so you might want to just give up and say, let's save our photography for another day. But when we were on the ship in New Zealand, when I was teaching on board a cruise ship and in New Zealand, and we were going to have the opportunity to visit the Doubtful Sound, the Dusky Sound, and the Milford Sound, these beautiful fjords that I had not visited previously. And then the weather turned against us, and we had winds that were exceeding hurricane force, 80+ knot winds, sustained winds over 80 knots, and a bit of rough seas. And given the circumstances, we were not able to get into the Doubtful or Dusky fjords, the sounds. And so it was looking like we were not going to get good conditions for the Milford Sound either. Thankfully, the weather improved along the way. Still not great, but we were at least able to get into the Milford Sound. And it was spectacular, of course. And so I was out photographing, even though the conditions were not ideal. It was overcast, it was dreary. Now, in fairness, that overcast sky actually made some of the photography a little bit easier because there was less contrast. And so that aspect worked out well, but it wasn't, still drizzling, a little bit of rain. It wasn't the most pleasant time to be out taking pictures. But I stuck it out. Obviously, it was remarkably beautiful to begin with, and so I wanted to take it all in. But on top of that, of course, weather changes, and sometimes changes dramatically. And after having had rain and wind, the conditions did start to improve. There were glimmers of sunshine. And of course, when you get sunshine on a day when it had been raining, there's a chance of rainbows. And so we were rewarded with a wonderful rainbow with a little bit of light hitting the side, the fjord here, one of these cliffs, with a little bit of the clouds wisping around a little bit and trickles of waterfalls visible off in the distance. And so it served as a good reminder that, even when the weather is a bit dreary, it might be worthwhile to stick around and see if things are going to improve, or to try to, at the very least, just make the best of the circumstance and see what sort of photographic opportunities might present themselves. And some of that is the weather might improve, for example, and you get great photos. And some of that might be that you stick it out and you find unique subjects, reflections in puddles, for example, or just the actual drops of rain creating interesting textures on the ground, and those sorts of things. So not giving up, essentially. Yes, at some point you're soaking wet, you're cold, and you just want to go indoors and have a hot cup of coffee. But to the extent that there may be photographic opportunities, I would certainly say, try not to give up on the weather, or at least not give up too quickly on the weather. All right, so as we're moving along here, I see there's a handful of questions that have popped up along the way. So let's address some of those here real quickly. Take a little detour for some questions. Jason asks if I use back button focus, and yes, absolutely, in part because I want to be able to separate my focusing from my taking of the picture. So I want to be able to set the focus and then reframe, for example. And so I do use back button focus. I highly recommend it, with the caveat that if you're not someone who uses back button focus already and you want to switch, make sure that you spend enough time practicing that you get to the point that that is completely automatic, that you essentially don't even realize that you're focusing. Don't even think about the fact that you're pushing that button. It's so automatic. Just as you don't really think, okay, now I'm going to push the button to take a picture. Likewise, you're just doing it automatically. So make sure that you don't essentially forget to autofocus. And related, Howard asks if I was using servo focus, if I was using what essentially is continuous focus. And so the answer is yes. I hesitate because it's a mixed answer, actually, because I'm using back button focus. So I have my camera always set to continuous autofocus. But that doesn't mean I'm always using continuous focus. So one of the nice things about this approach, I can enable my camera always set to continuous focus, continuous autofocus, but that continuous autofocus only happens if I press the back button focus button. And so I can choose essentially when I want to use continuous focus. So if I'm tracking a bird in flight, I'm going to be using continuous autofocus continuously, so I'm going to be pushing and holding that back button focus button the entire time. With a landscape, I would have my camera still set to continuous autofocus, but I'm going to get the effect of one-shot autofocus by virtue of pointing my camera to the subject I want to focus on, or moving my focus point, as the case may be, pressing the back button focus button until I have my shot set in terms of the focus, and then I can release that back button focus, reframe, and know that I'm taking a picture with that focusing not changing. I've locked in my focus at that point. So it's a little bit variable in the context of that back button focus. And then Adam asks about, what are your thoughts on shooting wide and cropping later versus getting it right in the camera? And so I would say, obviously, my preference is always to get it right in the camera. The problem is that I don't necessarily always make the best decision right at the time of taking the picture, meaning I think I know what I want, and then I end up wishing that I had shot a little bit wider or a little bit closer. And so there's that notion of, well, just shoot everything a little bit wide and you can crop later, keeping in mind perspective issues. You might want to get closer to or further away from the subject, but you then run the risk of, now you want to crop in too tightly and you've lost a lot of resolution along the way. So ideally, I want to get it perfect in the camera. I try to make sure to frame just a little bit wide so that if my framing was off a little bit, I've got room to correct for that essentially, and then I can crop to resolve that, shooting not tremendously wide, but just a little wide that I can crop later. But I think perhaps more importantly, in this context at least, is to get variations. To capture the same scene in a variety of different ways, with a variety of different framings. Not that you need countless variations of photos. I'm only trying to take pictures that I think are going to work out, but I want to get a variety of different options that I can review later in a more casual environment, you might say, where I'm able to pick and choose amongst those. I can always delete the outtakes if I want to. Excellent question. What happens to be, so it's a good segue here, the image that we're looking at right now, the rainbow in the Milford Sound. Gary asks, where was the camera focused? And in this case, I actually focused on the trees that are in full sunlight in the distance. And the reason, conceptually, I might have focused on the water in the foreground and stopped down enough that I have everything foreground to background in focus. At the time, my priority was more about that middle ground, so I wasn't worried about the foreground being in focus. I wasn't terribly concerned about the distant background being as sharp in focus. It was kind of misty and hazy back there anyway, and so I focused on the trees that are getting that full sunlight so that I knew the rainbow, to the extent that it can be, is in focus, so to speak. All right, we'll save some of the other questions here for the end of the presentation. Let's move on just a little bit. And now to some, I guess you might say, philosophical concepts that relate to our photography. One of the mistakes I have had a tendency to make is to stay outside, to not venture indoors into a potential subject, a potential scene for photography. Here, for example, in Barcelona, Spain, I'd visited Barcelona a number of times, and of course, the cathedral that is still under construction, but they're making quick progress with it. Every time that I visited over the last handful of years, it's obvious how much change has happened, how much progress they've made. But of course, to go inside, you need a ticket. You've got to wait in line. It takes some time. And I always figure, I've seen so many cathedrals. I don't need to go inside of this one as well. It's interesting on the outside. We'll call it good enough, which of course probably sounds silly because it is silly. But fortunately, on a recent trip, we decided, okay, we're going to make a point of going inside the cathedral, and thank goodness, because it is remarkably beautiful. And so at least peeking your head in and, seeing if a particular, in this case, cathedral or other building might be worth visiting, worth taking a look at. And certainly inside of the cathedral in Barcelona, we have lights, colored lights that in this case reflected on the pipes of the organ, creating really interesting color and texture. And just, as cathedrals do, having stained glass windows, for example, and interesting architecture, there were so many little perspectives, little vignettes that I would photograph along the way. I was so glad that I had gone inside to check out something that, maybe felt a little bit like a tourist scene, etc., but it was well worth it. So, sometimes just venturing, maybe it'll work out, maybe it won't, but you don't know if you don't try. So venturing in and seeing, what that subject might offer to you. Another, maybe I wouldn't even call this a mistake because I don't think of it as a mistake. It's something that I do very intentionally. It's my own bias, I guess, is to avoid people. I'm that guy who goes out and does quote unquote travel photography, but I'm waiting until all the travelers and the locals are out of my frame. I don't want any people in my frame. I just want the scene. Part of that is just personal preference. Part of it is the notion of, not wanting to need to get a model release if I'm going to use the photo later. So, here, for example, in Dakar, Senegal, there's a driver in this truck and I left him out of the frame. I wasn't even interested in photographing him. I just wanted to see the truck in the sand, etc. But, as I look around and there's interesting scenes with interesting people, and so wanting to try to broaden my horizons, you might say, and not be so stubborn about excluding people, but also then I can find, if I'm still concerned about that model release issue, if it's not a portrait session, for example, I can find ways to photograph a person. In this case, I was really photographing the song lyrics because I found the writing so beautiful. The script is really nice looking. It was interesting. But I wanted to include the singer as well. And so kind of looking over their shoulder and, the colorful flowers on their head and around their neck included, but out of focus, really just focusing. The person becomes sort of secondary. But sometimes the person is the key subject, but I can photograph in a way where they're not identifiable anyway, so I don't need to worry about a model release. Of course, sometimes just photographing the person, asking their permission, and taking a little, ad hoc portrait out there in the world, for example, can work very nicely. So it's something that I have to kind of constantly remind myself of, that people are interesting too, and I should photograph people, but I can also photograph them in a way where I'm not including their face. I'm not including anything that is identifiable, so I don't have to worry about that issue. And again, that's not to say I couldn't also photograph their faces as well and just get their permission to do so. But it's something that I need to remind myself of on a regular basis, not to avoid necessarily having people in your photos, even though I still do that most of the time, trying to remember that there are situations where it might be good to include the people in the frame as well. Another little tip, a mistake that I have made, fortunately I've avoided making this mistake sometimes, but that is not taking the advice of others. And I know that I had shared this story last year during another presentation, but we were in Luderitz, Namibia, or we were going to be anyway in Luderitz, Namibia. And, I had done a little bit of research, and it seemed like it was, just a coastal town, and that there wasn't going to be, too much going on, but we would just wander around and get lunch and see what we saw. And then someone asked if I was going to Kolmanskop, and I didn't know what that was. And they said, the ghost town. And I said, well, I don't know. We were thinking maybe, but maybe not. I'm not sure yet. And they looked at me like I was absolutely crazy, and then proceeded to show me photos of this Kolmanskop. And when I saw the photos, I said, oh yes, I know that place. I just had no idea that it was in Namibia, and that it was the ghost town that we were talking about, that we were going to be very close by. So we did go to the ghost town and wandered around and took photos, and it was absolutely fascinating. So if you don't know the story, this was a diamond mine a long time ago, and there were diamonds literally just in the sand dunes. So you could crawl around in the sand and find diamonds. And so there was I believe it was a German camp that was set up here, and I might be wrong about the nationality, but in any event, there was a camp that was set up, a town really, that was built in the middle of these sand dunes until they ran out of diamonds. And then they just left and went somewhere else. And so the sand is starting to take over. So here, for example, the hospital, looking down the hallway, and it's just sand all the way down the hallway. And some of the homes where the sand dunes are shifting constantly and just taking over the place. And so some of these houses are, half buried in sand. And it's just absolutely fascinating. And if I had skipped this location and then later realized what it was I had skipped, I would have been so disappointed. So I was so glad that I had taken the advice of a friend to actually make a point of venturing off to this area and capturing some photos. In other cases, of course, it's about time commitment or the challenge that's involved. So we were going to be visiting Kangaroo Island in Australia. And of course, as the name implies, there are kangaroos there. And we wanted to make sure to see kangaroos. So we rented a car and got some advice, and were told a good location where we were sure to see kangaroos, and we did. And we saw plenty of kangaroo as it turned out. But then we had to decide, are we going to drive all the way to the other side of the island? We had essentially just enough time to get over there, spend maybe an hour or so, and come back. Was it worth all that trouble in the hopes that we might see some other wildlife, maybe see some koalas, for example? Fortunately, we decided it was going to be worthwhile, and so we went to a park at the other end of the island where there were supposed to be lots of koalas, and we went into the visitor center and asked, what are the chances that we will see koala? And the ranger confidently said, 100%. He said, go around this trail and keep your eyes up in the tops of the trees. If you don't find any there, go out to the parking lot and look up. And if you still don't find any, come back in, let us know, and we'll take you out there and point them out to you, because it just means that your eyes aren't that good. And so we wandered down this trail and we saw a wallaby off in the distance, and actually it turned out to be a rather friendly wallaby. I was able to get reasonably close as it was foraging and get some nice little photos of this cute character. And then we explored and explored and explored, and finally, yes, we did see koalas. Now, the trick with koalas is they're not fast movers. They sleep most of the time, and anytime they're pretty much hanging out way up at the tops of the trees. And so they can be a little tricky to spot, and you're not exactly going to get close to them, generally speaking, to be able to get close-up photos. But it was really fun to see them and to photograph them, and so I was really glad that we had taken that time to drive all the way to the other side of the island to hopefully, and it obviously turned out that we would be able to see some koalas and other characters. I think another mistake, I certainly have made this mistake on more than one occasion, is skipping postcard locations, skipping, those sort of the places everyone goes. You go to Athens, Greece, and of course everyone goes to the Parthenon, and so it might seem like not the most interesting place to go, or you're going to think that you might respond that it wasn't worth all the hype, or whatever the case might be. But I do find that those locations that everybody visits, there's a reason that everybody visits them. And it usually means that it's an interesting place to see. And sometimes it still means it's an interesting place to photograph. Even if every other photographer has already photographed it, there is, I think, a satisfaction in photographing a subject that is interesting and beautiful, even if others have photographed it before you. And it's fun, I think, to explore around and try to see if you can come up with a unique way to photograph a scene. So here, for example, getting the sun in between the columns and a starburst effect, and what I hoped was a unique perspective on a subject that is photographed so many times by so many photographers. In other cases, so on the island of Santorini in Greece, for example, there's not a whole lot of options for photographing these blue domes. You can only get to them in a handful of little nooks, and so you're going to include the domes and therefore the background, and therefore you're kind of taking the same picture that everybody else has taken. And so I have to admit that when I learned where we were going to be dropped off on the island of Santorini, and that we'd have to go to the other end of the island in order to see these domes, I was debating whether or not I wanted to bother, because I already knew what they looked like. I knew that I wasn't going to get a photo that was necessarily, unique compared to what anybody else had photographed. And so I thought maybe it just wasn't going to be worthwhile. I'm so glad that I decided to go after all, because yes, I have a photo, and yes, it's just like, so many other photos that you've seen from Santorini, but it was really great to see. It was a beautiful scene, and so I was happy to have had that experience. So I think it can be a mistake in many cases to skip a location just because, it's on a postcard and everybody's already seen it. And then finally, I would say, making sure not to miss out on adventures, on potential opportunities. So here, for example, this was captured on the island, well, off the island, in the water near the island of Bora Bora, and the blacktip reef sharks. As it turned out, we went out on a little snorkeling tour, and I was the only one who got into the water here, the deep water, with these sharks. And again, using just a point-and-shoot digital camera, a waterproof little point-and-shoot, not a great quality camera. It's just a way of making sure that I could actually take pictures when I was underwater, so at least to document the experience a little bit. And so not that I suggest swimming with sharks. In this case, it's by all accounts pretty safe. It's certainly adventurous. It's certainly fun, if it doesn't scare you out of your mind. But just more generally, to make sure that you're not missing out on something just because it's maybe just a little beyond your comfort level. So not to put yourself in harm's way, of course, but to try to make sure that you're not missing out on fun opportunities. So for example, with these blacktip reef sharks, when the notion of getting into the water with sharks certainly doesn't sound like a smart idea. And I grew up in Southern California, so I would go surfing in the beaches, at the beaches of Southern California, and I was constantly worried a great white shark was going to come along and ruin my day. So naturally, the notion of getting into water with sharks seems a little bit crazy, but as soon as you get in the water and see that they are completely uninterested in you, and so they're not even paying attention, and it actually made it kind of easy to try to capture some photographs. So here with these cute little striped yellowfish that would follow along with them, I'm assuming to get the crumbs when they were feeding, but an opportunity that I would have missed out on both photographically and just as a fun adventure. And so something that I certainly, well, maybe not in the case of sharks, do what you're comfortable with, but at least trying to make sure that you don't miss out on an adventure that you could actually appreciate later. All right, so we've gone a little bit over time, but hey, under the circumstances, I think that's probably perfectly fine. And I would like to address some of the questions here that you've been posting. So first off, Al says about the sunburst picture. So that was the picture at the Parthenon in Athens, Greece. Would it damage your sensor? And I would say the answer is no. There's some slight risk, certainly, that if you had a filter, you can think of the notion of a magnifying glass, for example, putting a spot of light on the sensor, on the filter in front of the sensor. But for the duration that are involved in taking a photo, that is not an issue. So I certainly wouldn't use, for example, live view for an extended period of time when you've got the sun in the frame. But I have been including the sun in the frame constantly for many years, and I've never had any issues with it at all. And then, let's see, Richard asks about processing. So the underwater photos, as I mentioned, I sort of don't consider the underwater photos to be, I think of them almost as not being my real photos. They're more of my snapshots than they are my real photos. And not that you can't take incredible photos underwater, but it requires an underwater housing and strobes. If you really want to get into underwater photography, you've got to have the equipment for it. And I just love being in the water. And so I don't feel that I necessarily want to take on, what I would consider real underwater photography. But in terms of processing them, the real problem, the biggest problem I would say with underwater photography in terms of post-processing is color adjustment. And the color can be the biggest challenge by far. The colors get skewed, obviously, toward lots of blues and greens, and the camera can have a very difficult time getting that color accurate. So even when you're capturing with a raw photo, for example, it can take a rather strong color adjustment. And then contrast also tends to be a bit of a challenge in terms of being able to get good contrast, good black point. So you usually have to boost the contrast somewhat significantly. So they tend to require a fair bit of work. It takes more time to process an underwater photo than it does, a more typical a terrestrial photo. Susan asks a really good question, actually, about model releases. So I obviously do not take very many photos of people, but naturally, if I am going to photograph a person, I want to make sure to get a model release. So she asks if I carry a standard model release form when I travel, or do I keep that in my cell phone? I actually do keep that in my cell phone. There is an app called Easy Release, as in a model release, as in it's really easy to get a model release. And it's a great little app. So if you photograph people in your travels, I strongly recommend getting this app. It's really, really great. And you can record the details, the name, contact information, etc., about the person that you're photographing. And one of the key features that is so beneficial is you can use your smartphone within the app to take a picture of that person, of that subject. So now not only they can sign, by the way, right on the screen. So now not only do I have a signed model release, it includes a photo of the person, so it's very easy to cross-reference so that I know which person I've photographed. I can find very easily which person appears in which photograph based on those releases. So that definitely is an app that I would strongly recommend if you photograph people at all. Peter asks how I created the sunburst effect, with asking in parentheses if it was a software trick, essentially. And no, just by stopping the lens down. And I hear from a lot of photographers who think it's not possible to get a starburst without any special equipment or with post-processing. But if you stop your lens down to f/16, f/22, relatively small lens aperture size, and include the sun in the frame or other light sources, that's step one. Obviously, you need to make sure your exposure is set appropriately. If you've got the sun in the frame, you'll sometimes have to set an exposure compensation of -1 or 2 stops, depending on how you're framing, etc. But the key, and the reason that a lot of photographers think that a sunburst isn't possible or that you need to have the sun up against an object, is that you need what I refer to as a crisp light source, a non-diffused light source. And so if you think of a lamp, you need to not have a lampshade on it. It needs to be a naked bulb. If the light is diffused, it's not going to starburst. Well, in the context of the sun, that diffusion happens with a hazy atmosphere. So if it's really hazy, then the sunburst will be minimal or it won't be there at all. So you want ideally nice clear skies. That's going to give you the best sunburst. But if you've got clear skies, the sun in the frame, and you stop down that lens, you'll get yourself a sunburst, which I obviously happen to like a lot. I tend to create sunburst effects if I'm including the sun in the camera, in the frame, I should say. Some people think it's just too cliche and they don't like it, but that's my take. And Ronald mentions not a question, actually. Well, I guess there is a sort of a question built in here, but more of a tip that he's sharing, which is a great one, actually. He says that one of his most common mistakes is to leave a particular camera setting on. So, for example, in one situation, he might want a 2-second delay. He takes the shot, and then he goes on to the next subject, and he's all excited to take a picture, takes the photo, except he didn't. It's a 2-second delay, and he might miss the shot as a result. And so he asks if there's anything to remember to restore the settings. And what I recommend, if your camera supports it, is a preset. So one of two approaches here. Number one is many cameras have the option for saved settings so that you can very quickly switch, for example, to a setup for bracketed exposures for HDR. I set one of my presets on my camera to my default basic setup so that I can very quickly get to my standard setup with all my various camera settings adjusted, including exposure. And so I think that is a great approach, or just being in the habit of, as soon as you're finished photographing a subject, do a little bit of a reset. What settings do you think you're likely to use next? Or in the absence of a specific idea, what's sort of a good general setting? So for me, for example, setting the camera to aperture priority with an aperture of f8, an ISO setting of 400, that's going to be a good sort of generic setup that works for most scenarios, and then I can work from there as needed. I could at least get a basic photo, and then maybe I need more depth of field or less depth of field or different shutter speed, and I can make adjustments. But either making a point of making sure to reset manually, so to speak, or of making a point of using a preset if your camera is so equipped. Oh, and so Mark asked about if I'm shooting handheld with that long range, that all-in-one wide-angle to telephoto zoom lens. So I mentioned that I was using on one of these trips an 18 to 400 millimeter lens, and so he's asking if I'm shooting handheld. At the wide-angle end, obviously, no problem at all to shoot handheld in most cases. But going out to a telephoto, 400 millimeter focal length, obviously that gets to be a little bit dicey. But the nature of my photography and my travels are such that I do tend to shoot handheld. And that's why I mentioned there, for example, a good generic setting includes an ISO of 400. Under normal circumstances on a sunny day, 400 is higher than you need. You could just set the ISO to 100, for example. but I like to have it a little higher to make sure I'm getting a little bit faster shutter speed so that I can compensate for the fact that so much of my photography is handheld. And just with handheld, of course, this all-in-one that I'm using is not a particularly heavy lens, but sometimes I'm using a lens that is quite heavy. And for example, a 150 to 600 millimeter lens, it's going to be a bit on the heavy side by virtue of enabling you to get out to 600 millimeters. And so that, of course, is going to mean there's a little more chance of camera movement when you're hand holding. And so naturally, faster shutter speed, higher ISO in order to achieve that. And then just being careful in your technique. So for example, bracing the arm that's supporting the lens, brace against your body, or brace the camera on something like a beanbag. Obviously, if you can use a tripod, so much the better. But the point is to try to maximize your potential for image quality. All right, let's see here. Natalie asks about the products that I recommend for sensor cleaning and that Photographic Solutions. I had to think there for a moment. Photographic Solutions is the company whose products I recommend. They've got the sensor swabs and the solution. So if you're going to do it yourself, please be very, very careful. Keep in mind that if you damage your camera, the delicate components inside the camera, it's not going to be covered by your warranty, and it can be an expensive thing to fix. So make sure to watch some videos about how to clean, and if you're not comfortable with it, send it off to someone else. And then finally, as we wrap up here, a little bit over time, I hope you'll bear with me. I hope you don't mind me going a little bit longer so that we can address some questions. But a couple of you, Mary Lou and Ron, both asked if it was okay to share the recorded webinar with their friends. Not only is it okay, it is strongly encouraged and most certainly appreciated. So those of you who registered, you will receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording of the webinar presentation. It'll be on my Tim Gray TV channel on YouTube, which I encourage all of you to subscribe to so that you'll get notifications. If you enable that notification feature, you'll be more likely to be able to track down my videos as we publish additional videos. But yes, by all means, please do share that recording with others. And as a final note, thank you, first of all, very much for joining me here today. And if, like me, many of you are under the stay-at-home orders due to the current pandemic, you've got some extra time at home, and you might be looking for things to do. If one of the things on your to-do list is to clean up your mess in Lightroom, my Cleaning Up Your Mess in Lightroom course is aimed at just that, to help you restore order to your Lightroom Classic catalog. And you can get it for $10 off if you use the link shown here, timgray.me/mess2929, and that will direct you to the GreyLearning website with that $10 discount applied automatically. So that'll enable you, give you a wide variety of lessons to help you clean up your mess in Lightroom Classic, restore order to that Lightroom catalog. Once again, thank you very much for joining me for today's presentation. Thank you to Tamron for sponsoring the GreyLearning webinar series. We'll look forward to seeing you online again very soon. Thanks very much.